It's 10 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started with our second session of the day. Welcome to anyone just joining us this morning, and welcome back to those of you who joined us for our 9 a.m. session. We are happy that you could make time in your busy schedules to attend the fourth week of Illinois Soybean Association's Agribusiness Management Program Summer Webinar Series. I'm Emily Carls, field staff for Illinois Farm Business Farm Management and one of the AMP advisors for ISA. Today's second presentation is Look Beyond Cash Rent, Growing Your Leased Acres with Farm Managers and Investors. But before we get started, we wanted to review a few housekeeping items. For any CCAs in the audience, if you stay with us for our 10 a.m. session, you earn 1 CEU in professional development. We will have details at the end of the webinar on how to access your credit. I'd also like to take this time to again thank today's session sponsor, Compeer Financial. Compeer's support of this program, along with our partners and sponsors, is invaluable to its success. Now I'd like to introduce our last speaker of the day, Jonah Kolb. Jonah Kolb is managing member of Warner Ag Group LLC in Clinton, Illinois, and manages its brokerage and farm management subsidiary, Moore & Warner Farm Real Estate LLC. He leads business development and consulting initiatives working with private and institutional investors to build direct farmland portfolios. Jonah holds an MBA from the Kellogg School at Northwestern University. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to you, Jonah.
Thanks, Emily. And Emily, can everybody see me okay? I just want to double check before I get launched here.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for doing a bit of a double header this morning. It is looking like, for those of you that follow Major League Baseball, we're going to get to have double header webinars, but maybe not double header ball games this year. I'm going to jump right in and try to keep things moving this morning. Because I realize you all, if it's a nice day where you are, probably have some other things you'd like to get to as well. So from an agenda standpoint, let me start with a quick introduction. I want to do a little myth busting and then define this counterparty of choice. But the topic for today is looking beyond cash rent, thinking about how you grow your leased acreage with farm managers and investors. And so first, let me just touch on a little bit more what it is that we do here in Warner. We are a farm management, farmland investing, brokerage, consulting firm. If you think about Midwest dirt, we probably do something related to it. We manage across 4 states in every lease type under the sun, whether that's crop share, custom, fixed cash rent, flex or variable rent, you name it. We have experience with it or are managing farms under it today. We work with owner clients, big and small. And by that, I mean big from some of the largest institutional investors in the country who invest in farmland as a financial asset, to small landowners and your stereotypical, single widow living in St. Louis that owns a quarter section here in central Illinois. We also work with farmers, big and small, and that ranges from some of the biggest operators in the state of Illinois in the Midwest to the operators that's really a single full-time person who is just large enough to be farming as a full-time career. And we've been doing this here from our office in Clinton, managing farm ground for 165 years and some 6 generations. So I'd like to think that we have a little bit of perspective on this topic. I will fully acknowledge I've not been here doing this that whole time. So I want to start off by addressing some common myths. And first is, I don't need to grow to survive. And if you're plugged into this AMP webinar series, you're already thinking about how to carry on your operation, how to increase profitability and grow over time. I will say it's not always necessary to grow your acreage to survive, but growth in some form, whether that's diversification of income, improving your margins, or increasing the amount of acreage that you farm on, is needed to survive if you want to be a multi-generational farming operation. So that's myth number 1. Myth number 2, farm managers are the boogeyman. We're not. I like to think that I'm a friendly person. Farm managers are professionals. We serve a really important role in the market, but I also realize that any number of farmers have had maybe an unpleasant experience with a farm manager at some point in their career. And I'd say, give us a chance. In our office, we like to say that good farm management is a service to both sides. What do we mean by that? Our job is to help translate between a landowner client and a farmer. Now, at the end of the day, we only have one client. It's the landowner. But our role is helping translate perspective, financial objectives, the reality of weather, production, commodity markets from landowner to farmer and from farmer to landowner client. Myth number 3, I have to pay the highest cash rent to pick up additional acreage. And that's why I've got a slash through the dollar signs here. It's not true. Do you need to be competitive? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you don't have to be the highest in a cash rent auction to pick up more leased acreage. And then myth number 4, investors drive up the price of farmland. Anecdotally, everybody knows that who pays the highest amount for a piece of ground? It's usually the neighboring farmer or a couple of neighbors that don't get along and really want that sweet 80 or quarter section. The reality is that investors are buying farm ground to meet financial return objectives. And as such, there really is an upper limit in what most investors will pay for a given farm. And so our view is that investors really bring important liquidity to a market. We want there to be lots of buyers and sellers for a market to work well, and that's something that investors do. The other thing that I think is important to realize, and Bruce Sherrick at the University of Illinois does a good job when he speaks about farmland investing in these topics, is that investors are still really only true financial investors, I should say, are still only maybe 1% of the overall land ownership here in Illinois. They're a pretty small portion of the overall market. So next I want to jump to a reality check. And the first is that farm leases operate in a free market. Leases require a willing lessor, a landowner, and a willing lessee, a farmer. And when we set aside situations that involve family, right? If you're dealing with mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or aunt and uncle or sister and brother, whomever, those are not free market situations. But when we're dealing in a free market, you end up having a market that sets its own price levels. Now, just because if we're talking about cash rents, we may not like the prices and we may not like the rent levels, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't or shouldn't be a free market. So that's number 1. Number 2 on my reality checks is about this idea of fair. And fair is dynamic over time. We think leases need to be fair. Everybody has to be able to make money, landowner and farmer, if you want a long-term successful relationship. And I can tell you here at Warner, we've actually turned down clients who came to us with really unrealistic expectations about farm income and returns, and they thought fair meant we're going to put as much risk on the farmer as possible and extract as much money as possible. Those aren't clients that we will take on. But when I say fair is dynamic over time, what I'm really saying is that we need to think about and wonder if a lease that was fair in 1960 or 1980 or 2000 or 2020 is fair today. And fairness considers things like time, effort, capital, and those things apply equally to landowners and farmers. If we think about the span of, let's say, several decades, now, I ask, what does it mean if a farmer can farm twice as much acreage with roughly the same number of pieces of equipment, with the same or less labor, and produce 30% more yield on a per acre basis? What does it mean if a landowner who's owned land for a decade or more now has 3 times as much capital tied up in their ground as they did when they first bought or inherited that farm? No industry experiences advancements in innovation, technology, risk, science. No industry experiences those things moving lockstep together over time, and agriculture is no different. And so a lease structure that made sense, let's say, a few decades ago may need to be considered relative to the industry reality today. Now, I want to be clear. What I'm not saying here is that there's no role for a 50-50 crop share. There absolutely is. And here at Warner, we actually manage thousands and thousands and thousands of crop share acres. But the details of those leases have actually changed over time to reflect changes in production practices and equipment. When I hear a farmer say 50-50 is fair and that's the way it should be, what I actually hear is two different things that are being mixed together and combined. So one is about a value, and the value is fairness. And I'd say, yeah, that should be everlasting. Fairness should be everlasting. But the second thing that I hear is a detail, and that's around a 50-50. That's a crop split. And that's a detail that needs to reflect the farm, the specifics, the market, the time. So we'll come back to some of these in a little bit, but fair is dynamic over time, and we can't assume that what is contractually fair in one time period is going to be contractually fair years and years ahead. So third reality check here is the multi-decade commercial and ownership trends are clear, and you really don't need me to tell you this. Absentee land ownership and investor land ownership have gone up and are increasing over time. And if you're thinking about passing, like the last session on succession planning, if you're thinking about passing your farm operation on to the next generation, there's going to be a role interacting with absentee landowners or investors if there is not today. And for almost everybody on this webinar, there's probably already that role today. And then lastly, in terms of the reality check, and nobody in this price environment needs me to remind them of this fact, commodity crops are commodities. And one of the definitions of our capitalist system is that we try to get as close to perfect competition as we can is a function of our free markets. And one of the definitions of perfect competition and perfect competition within a commodity market is that over time profits go to zero. And what that means is that if we want to be profitable, we've constantly got to be moving and innovating. There is no other way to survive in a commodity market. Stagnation is starvation. And I'll touch on this a little bit later as well. So I want to frame this topic of growing leased acres from a farmer perspective and thinking about being the counterparty of choice. Now, if you've been with the AMP series from the very beginning, the very first one, I think it was on July 8th, were the good folks from Farmer Mac talking about being bankable. And one of the terms they used was counterparty. How is a farmer a counterparty? And when I think about picking up leased acreage, I think about this idea of counterparty of choice. So let me first start with a definition of counterparty. So Merriam Webster says it's a party to a financial transaction. Now the word "to" there is actually really important because a party for a financial transaction, that's a backyard barbecue that you throw after you close on your new house. And if you've forgotten, a backyard barbecue is one of those things that used to invite a bunch of friends over with a cooler full of cold ones, before COVID happened. So a party to a financial transaction, that's just somebody who's in the financial agreement. A farmer is the counterparty to a landowner in the lease, but if you flip that around, the landowner is also the counterparty to a farmer as well. This goes both ways. And this session is really thinking about presenting the farmer and farm operation to farm managers and investors and how to make yourself attractive for those leasing opportunities. There's probably a separate session talking about screening from a farmer standpoint, talking about screening those land investors and owners and managers on who you actually want to work with or don't. But again, that's a little bit of a separate topic. But this idea of counterparty, it's somebody else on an agreement. And from a counterparty standpoint, the reason I talk about counterparty of choice rather than saying farmer of choice, because I want to emphasize this idea that it's not just farming. When you live and breathe ag every single day, sometimes it's easy to think about this is just what we do, and it's possible to lose sight of the bigger picture. And a farmer is stewarding a long-term, multi-million-dollar asset for a landowner. A farmer is engaging in high-risk activities on that asset. That's operating machinery, applying regulated chemicals, driving 80,000-pound semis over long hours at night during harvest. And that farmer is providing really important annual income, regardless of whether it's an investor or a private owner. And this last one is important, right? If I think about a pension fund, for example, or an insurance company that might be an investor in farm ground, they're taking that annual farm income and they're using it to pay municipal retirees, write their monthly checks. They're using it to pay insurance indemnities, or in the case of a private landowner, it may be funding someone's retirement or getting their kids through school. And yes, it's farming, but it's all these other things as well. And I use the idea of counterparty because I want to capture some of the business components and risk components of the relationship between landowner and farmer. So what's the counterparty of choice? I've defined counterparty from more of a technical standpoint. What does it look like in reality? To me, it looks like this. You're busy on the farm, getting things done, your cell phone rings, and you pick it up, and it's the manager or investor that you know, and they're calling to ask, do you want to lease this new farm? I think it would be a good fit for you. They've already pre-selected you as the farmer to farm this ground. They're not asking you to participate in a cash rent auction. They're not asking you to submit your resume. They're saying, this is the opportunity. Do you want to go? Getting to that point can take a while, and that's really the bulk of what we're going to talk about this morning. And in some years, getting to that point can take years and years, but the payoff can be significant. For some of you who've heard me talk on this subject, I like to tell a story about a farmer that we got to know very well over the course of a couple of years. And then in the course of probably 3 or 4 months, an investor that we were working with at Warner that we were representing bought 3 or 4 farms in that farmer's operating radius. There was never a question of leasing it to anyone else. And that farmer grew his farmed acreage by about 25% or more in one fell swoop. That's the type of meaningful step change that can really move your business forward, that can help you bring a child back onto the farm, help you bring new employees in, and it comes from being this counterparty of choice. And that operator that benefited from that opportunity, and we're still trying to buy ground for him to farm today, got there by doing the kinds of things, and in many cases, pretty much everything that I'm going to talk about in the next set of slides here. So how do you get there? That's really the core of the question. Becoming the counterparty of choice is 4 things in my mind. First, you've got to be ready to play ball financially and play ball in the right ballpark and in the right league. Number 2, you've got to present your farm operation well. Number 3, develop relationships with managers. And number 4, bring value beyond just economics and yield. The title of this talk is Looking Beyond Cash Rent. So I don't want to spend too much time on this first one, being ready to play ball financially, but it is worth just a minute here. So the ticket to entry from picking up leased acres from managers and investors is that you have to have competitive economics. Competitive does not mean the highest. Competitive, it's a range. It depends on what we're talking about. In our office, we like to talk about how farming is first a business, and it's a business that can support a wonderful lifestyle, like any well-run business can, but it's a business. And we cross enough of the country and we work with enough farmers to tell you that there are farmers in farm families who definitely get business and lifestyle confused. There are some who choose a lifestyle over a business as their top priority, and that's fine. That's a totally acceptable choice. It's just really important that that personal decision is being made explicitly and with purpose. And this has nothing to do with size or the equipment line that you're running or how big a line you have from the bank. This has everything to do with mindset. And it's possible to run a 1,000-acre operation as a well-oiled business, while a neighbor who might be farming over several thousand acres is covering 2 to 3 times as much ground, but is running what we would consider to be more of a lifestyle and not a well-run business. Why do I harp on this? It's because when I talk about competitive economics, this gets down to how are you actually running your business? And competitive is a range, and it really depends on the lease market, the land market, a given landowner, how competitive leases are in your area. Sometimes that range from a cash rent standpoint might be pretty tight. Maybe it's $20 an acre. Maybe it's a little bit wider. Maybe it's more like $50 an acre. But it's not just around cash rent. Competitive can be around crop share and custom and flex as well. And this is where using flex leases and bonus payments can really be to your advantage. About this time last year, we started working with one of our clients and the farmer on their farm. And they were wanting to change leases, and they were really targeting $330 to $350 an acre for some high quality, flat, black, well-drained dirt, a quarter section here in central Illinois. The challenge was that the farmer who'd been on that farm understood that they wanted to change leases, but they were really uncomfortable at that kind of fixed cash rent level. And so what we ended up doing is we had a very detailed set of conversations around budgets, and we ended up on a flex lease with a base of $285 split over 2 payments. And if the prices and yields are there, then that landowner can absolutely make $330 to $350. But the farmer's not on the hook for that full fixed cash rent amount. And that's where we were able to use a flex lease and a bonus payment to help a farmer manage risk, but include an option to hit the financial targets that owner has over time. In a year like this one, I don't think that operator is actually going to pay any bonus payments, and that's perfectly okay. So that's, I think, enough on this idea of ticket to entry competitive economics. I want to flip next to presenting your farm operation. Up on this slide, I have a very short overview that's similar to what we might include in the materials that we send to a client. It says on here, Jane Doe Family Farms is a progressive 3-generation, 2,000-acre operation based in DeWitt County. They're exclusively no-till, tech-oriented, and competitive on cash rent rates. If you know a Jane Doe Family Farms, I picked that name out of thin air, and it's a perfect happenstance. What I want you to think about in looking at this overview is, what is a manager or an investor going to use for their 2-sentence summary of my farm operation, number one, and number two, if I help them come up with that, and if I help shape what that overview and description is going to be, or are they coming up with it entirely on their own? And so what I want to do here is get into really the details around formally presenting information on your farm. And I've seen PowerPoints, brochures, resumes, written narratives. Personally, I prefer to have a cover letter and a short bulleted overview or a brochure with all of the pertinent details. More traditional resumes and page and a half long form narratives are, at least in my personal opinion, a little bit dated. But you know what they say about opinions, so take that for what it's worth. The more important piece here is to capture all of the relevant details. And the relevant details are the basics. Who are the key personnel in your farming operation? Who owns it? Who works there? What's your operating radius? How far do you travel? What's your total acreage size? That's not a manager or an investor trying to be nosy, trying to understand how significant is your operation. How much of a change would it be if you're going to take on a new full section? What are your production practices? Are you spraying only nitrogen? Do you vertical till? Are you no-till? What's your equipment list? An equipment list matched with your scale is interesting to a manager or investor because they're trying to understand, are you sufficiently equipped to farm the total acreage? Are you just on the brink? Do you need to be thinking about an investment in new equipment? Is difficult weather going to be a challenge because you're stretching the limits of how many acres you can get over with the equipment in your fleet today? Do you have specialized skills? Are you farming organically, non-GMO? Do you have equipment to reshape terraces or do minor drainage projects or fix a ditch with a hi-ho? And then technology. And I'm not talking about auto steer here. I'm really talking about, are you using accounting software? Do you have field level financial reporting? Are you using climate or some other software to aggregate all your farm data and share that with the different folks that you need and who are your trusted advisors? Is all of that accessible, and is it your fingertips? Is that your strong suit? Do you have someone else in the operation that focuses on that? And then lastly on here is reporting. What can you provide to a manager or owner in terms of reporting, and is it standardized? ultimately, what I'm trying to get at with asking for all this information from a farm operator is I'm trying to understand, where are you innovating and where are you driving profit? In the reality of the commodity markets and competition that I talked about a few minutes ago, can't stand still. And I want to be understanding, what are the moving pieces in your farming operation that lead me to think we're going to start a relationship on the lease for next crop year, and we're going to have a relationship 10, 15, and 20 years from now. So an example of another short overview before I move on might sound something like this. Joe Smith runs a smaller 1,000-acre operation hungry to grow. He improves economics of crop share leases by performing small and medium tiling projects, clearing ground, and doing surface drainage with his own equipment. Right? That captures in a nutshell some of an operator. Maybe he's not competitive on cash rent rates, and that's okay. There are going to be opportunities for him to pick up leased acreage as well. So number 3 on my list is developing relationships with managers. And the goal here is to have a relationship that predates an agreement, because that's what actually helps the lease to happen. And the question that I want to ask is, are you giving, are you taking, or are you doing both in developing that relationship with a manager? And are you focusing on consistency and content? Consistency is that it's not just happenstance once every 18 months when you remember to touch base with a manager or an investor. You actually got it on something of a schedule, and we're used to hearing exactly what that's going to be. So the next step here is that I really want to talk about is, what's the content of that give and take? And that's, if I can get the slide up, okay. That actually is captured, if you want to do some extracurricular reading, in a great book written by Adam Grant called Give and Take. And he talks about how you build relationships over time and balancing these two things. From my perspective, give is about helping a manager, and take is about growing your operation. And I'm thinking about this in the course of developing a relationship that predates a lease, and developing a relationship with touch points and networking over time. So from a give standpoint, what's useful or valuable to a manager? A heads up on land that's coming up for sale, either for that manager to purchase for a client or potentially to broker. An update on new practices or technology. You know, are you sharing the results of your side-by-side trials? Did you do a cover crop? Did it go particularly well? What insights would you share? You know, from the tech side, did you try something new? Did you try a new aerial imaging service this year? Did you like it? Did you not like it? This is not about sharing your secret sauce as an operator. This is just about passing on useful knowledge that a manager might be interested in. You know, there's other industry intel, things like, hey, we heard that ADM is closing this elevator and it's going to go totally non-GMO next year. Thought maybe you hadn't heard of it yet. Those are the types of things that can be interesting for a manager as well. And then lastly, your farm update as it's relevant to the manager. Maybe you know a manager or investor is active on a certain side of the county, and you just started picked up a farm and you started farming over there as well. That's an update that's relevant to a manager. Or maybe you suddenly have access to a seed contract or a non-GMO contract that you didn't before. That's relevant to a manager that might be thinking about that for one of their farms. So if that's the give, and really thinking about helping a manager, there's also a take, and this is the ask, growing your operation. It is perfectly acceptable to ask, hey, are there any upcoming open leases that I can put my name in for? Are you looking for land near me? The message here is, I remain interested. And being explicit about that ask is actually pretty important. But I want to hear that ask in the context of a deeper and broader relationship with a farmer. So let me jump to the next one and talk about bringing value beyond just yield and rent. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of value to a manager and value to a landowner. From a manager perspective, there is huge value in communication, reporting, transparency, technology. That helps me serve my clients better. It helps me do my job better and do it easier. So what does this stuff look like? This is pushing field and crop updates, not waiting to be asked, hey, when did you plant that field, right? Getting that out to the manager on a timely basis. On a reporting standpoint, reporting comes in many forms. Sometimes that's a condensed summary of the entire crop year that you would send to a land manager or an owner that you work with. Maybe that needs to be updated or tweaked depending on who it is and their sophistication level. But that type of annual check-in, at the very least, is really a best practice. And it paves the way for conversations around necessary improvements like we're going to need to do tile, or we need to do some other drainage work, or we need to think about adjusting the lease terms because we've got a wet pocket here that's not profitable. Transparency is about sharing what you're doing in your operation on a specific farm, and it also means financial transparency. We tend to keep our financial pictures in hidden in a tightly locked up little place, and sometimes that works, right? I, as a manager, am not interested in all of your personal family financials. I do care about the financials of your farm operation because you're a counterparty operating on a multi-million-dollar asset. But I also care about the actual financials on the farms that we manage. And I can tell you point blank, the farmers with whom we at Moore & Warner as managers will grow the most, and with whom our investor clients will grow the most, are those farmers with whom we can sit down and have a real conversation with real numbers and real budgets and talk about real profits and margins. And it's not because we're trying to extract value from here or there. It's because coming at it eyes wide open allows us to have an open and honest conversation about how a lease should function, what our expectations are around risk sharing and profit sharing over the long term. A few minutes ago, I told a story about working with an operator on a flex lease, and we ended up setting a lower base than we initially thought. And it's because we had a very real conversation with real budgets and real prior year financials in hand, fully transparent conversation. It was about our farm returns and crop budget. It wasn't a black box, and it really shouldn't be. The next on this list is technology. And when I talk about this, I think about how technology impacts a farmer's ability to be a counterparty of choice and some of these other things on the line here. So with some of the farmers that we work with, or actually almost all the farmers we work with, we ask them to fill out a crop year report. It's the final record of what happened in every field. So think about variety selected, planting population, herbicide program, application dates and rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the way through yield. Sometimes I have to chase operators to get those forms back to our office. And sometimes I have operators who I'll ask them for this info and they say, hold on a second. They pull up their farm management software and I have a PDF report, perfectly formatted, easy to read, with more detail than I can ever possibly want in my email inbox in the course of a couple of minutes. So one of those tech products that comes to mind is Granular, but they're certainly not the only software out there that can do this. That's a technology investment that a farmer made. It's helping that farmer become the type of counterparty that I want to work with in my business. Because when we get that type of reporting, it's detailed, it's comprehensive, it's timely, we can focus on other components of our management business, serving our clients, working with that farmer, rather than just chasing down details and paperwork. Bringing value beyond yield and rent also applies to the landowner. And I think about that in a few different ways. These might be production practices. Are you no-till? Are you doing cover crops? Are you specialty? Are you organic? Do you have a particular way that you approach sustainability topics? Those, as increasingly as we step into a new generation of owners that includes a lot of millennials and folks who have a broader or different set of sustainability, those types of things are increasingly important. Are you in a position to do improvement projects and maintenance on a farm? Yeah, that has an economic component to it, but not having to hustle out and get a contractor for every little thing that needs to be dealt with is value to the landowner. Are you in a position from grain storage and trucking to open up that landowner to specialty contracts or a market that they wouldn't have access to otherwise? That doesn't mean you give it away for free necessarily, but it may create value for them as well. Similarly, do you have access to contracts? Is your operation large enough, or do you have a the depth of relationship on a seed contract or somewhere else that you can bring to a new farm. From a tech standpoint, are you recording information? Are you keeping a data stack on your farm that you can provide to a landowner that will be useful when they think about selling their farm in a few years, or even just understanding what it is that they own? There are plenty of absentee landowners who either never have or have barely set foot on their farms. I can tell you as a farm manager, we do our best to get our clients out and on their farms as much as possible. The better they understand it, the better they are as owners. But technology can be used to help share info on the farm. Maybe it is aerial imaging and some other things that talk about what you've been doing on that farm in a year. And then lastly, farm tours and landowner days. Having that fun bonding experience with your farm if you're a landowner is helpful, and sometimes the farmer is the best person to facilitate that. Every landowner is different. Their ownership objectives are different. And in many cases, those ownership objectives are more complex than just financial goals. For some landowners, sure, it's all about the size of the cash rent check, but really owners are much more varied than that, and their objectives and priorities are more varied than that. So the other things that you can bring to the table matter in thinking about being competitive on any given farm and any given lease. So to recap, the things that I just stepped through around becoming the counterparty of choice. So one, being ready to play ball financially is really, really important. Got to be in the right ballpark, got to be in the right league. Doesn't mean you have to be at the top of the game all the time. Number two, present your farm operation well. Even if an operator gets to know you, help them out by providing the formal documentation and all of the details so that we know you well and we can support why you're a recommended candidate to one of our clients. Develop relationships with managers. Think about that consistency and content. Is there a give in the relationship that makes me want to pick up the phone and catch up with you? Now, don't get me wrong. I like to shoot the breeze just as much as anybody else, preferably on a cool morning as the sun's coming up, clear blue sky. That's a fine way to catch up and build relationships, but there has to be a content portion of that as well. And then lastly, think about bringing value that's beyond just economics and yield. What else can you bring to the fore that might match with landowner priorities that might help a manager do their job better or more efficiently? All of those things end up mattering in a real way, sometimes more than you might expect. So I want to share a couple of additional thoughts before we flip over and take some questions. And the first is that average is a benchmark. It's not the goal. Probably my two least favorite lines in production agriculture are one, well, that's the way it's always been done. And two, well, that's what everyone does. Average is fine as a benchmark, but it's not good enough if long-term survival as a viable farming operation is your goal. And I come back to commodity markets and intense competition. Average will be competed away to zero profits over time. Every business in every industry has to be moving forward and innovating. That doesn't mean that you're outgrowing acreage by paying top dollar cash rent. You've got to be thinking about what am I doing new next year that grows my profitability, revenue, skill set, etc. if you want to be in business over the long term. So that's an additional piece of advice, number one. Additional piece of advice, number two, please read and understand your leases. From a management and an investor standpoint, there's a lot of thought and legal time that goes into developing those leases. As you'll note, they're usually a lot longer and more detailed than your typical form leases that you might get from extension. And the reason I want you to read and understand your leases is that we're not trying to sneak anything in there. The leases spell out a set of obligations and responsibilities for both the landowner and the farmer, and sometimes the manager too. But we expect everyone to perform to those expectations. And you can't perform to those expectations if you don't have a clear understanding of what they are. And there are 4 things that I can tell you from our experience are somewhat commonly missed by farmers when they're reading through leases. They tend to focus on what's the economic split and when do I owe payments. The four things that are overlooked are insurance requirements, soil testing, data clauses, and repairs. So on insurance, when you're working with farm managers and investors, everyone's a little bit different, but there may very well be insurance requirements that are different from some of your other leases, requiring different types of coverage or different coverage levels. It is not out of the realm of possibility. I can tell you we have this in our leases that a farm operation is going to be expected to carry a $5 million umbrella policy above and beyond more traditional $1 million commercial policy limits. So read that insurance requirements, understand if you need to get certificates of coverage, if you need to add additional insureds for your landowners onto your policies. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but it is something that I find frequently gets overlooked. So that's number one. Number two, soil testing. How frequently do you have to do it and who's paying for it? Sometimes that gets missed down in the details. Number three, what are the terms around data sharing, ownership, who owns it, what's expected to be shared, how does that all work? This is increasingly important, and I can tell you, if it's not a big deal on your farms today, it will be in 5 and 10 years. So start to pay attention to those data clauses now. Make sure you're comfortable with them. If you don't understand, ask the manager or owner, why are you asking for this data? What are you going to do with it? That should be a real conversation between owner and farmer. And then lastly, repairs. Make sure you're paying attention to how repairs will be addressed. Are you responsible for a minimum up to a certain amount? Is that on a field or farm basis? It might be the kind of thing, if you're working with some larger landowners, that first $1,000 in repairs are the farmer's responsibility. That makes a big difference if it's $1,000 in repairs across all of the farms that you farm for them, or if it's on a per farm or per property or per field basis. And then lastly, in my additional advice, over communicate. Communicate more than you think you need to and more detail than you think you need to. I'll tell you if it's too much. Text, call, email. I don't love problems in my business, but I can handle them. What I don't like, what my clients don't like, are surprises. So when I think about this and working with our clients, sometimes we'll be telegraphing to our clients, laying the groundwork, telling them what's coming down the pike, literally years ahead of a potential problem. Maybe we're 3 to 5 years out on thinking we might need to address some erosion or drainage, but we're laying that foundation. So when we finally come to, okay, we have an improvement project that's going to cost $20,000, it's an idea and a concept that they're familiar with because we've been talking about it for 5 years. The same thing can be said of the farms that you farm and communicating what you think might be problems, what might develop into problems, whether that's in a given lease year because it's weather or commodity price related, or it's over a period of time. But in general, communicate, communicate, communicate. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn this back in, and I think you have an opportunity to pose questions in the chat function, and I'm happy to address any that you may have.
Thank you, Jonah, for sharing your perspective on farm operations. We do have a little time for questions here. One question we have is, do farm management services work off of gross revenue or profit?
That's an excellent question. It depends on the owner, it depends on the firm. I hate giving the it depends answer. It always feels like a cop-out, but it really depends on a given, just like leases are bespoke contracts between a farmer and a custom contract between a farmer and a landowner. Farm management agreements between a farm management company and a landowner vary. I'd say on average, farm management agreements are usually based on gross, but net is becoming increasingly common. There are also farm management agreements that are based on asset value. And in other words, what's the farm worth and it's a percentage of that. Obviously, it's a very small percentage, but there are all sorts of different ways to slice that. And it really depends on the farm management firm and what the landowner's comfortable with, what they might be familiar with, and what some of their objectives are. Good question.
Perfect, thank you. And then another question is, do you have any specific suggestions for young producers who are maybe not quite established and they're looking to grow their operation, but maybe don't have some of the capital behind them that somebody who's been farming for 10 or 15 years does? Do you have any suggestions for those producers?
Yes, this is in part a strategy question, a farming strategy question, and this is in part a working with farm managers question. On the farm strategy, you've got to figure out how you're going to get it done. Where are you getting your equipment from? How are you covering your acreage? How are you running your finances? That's a little bit of a different topic. From a farm management standpoint and working with farm managers, the story is really important. And having whatever the plan that you developed is, having that in a way that makes sense is really important. You'd be surprised. We do have landowners who say, you know what? Income is not my highest priority. I'd like to give a young operator or somebody who's getting into farming a chance. We can't have the conversation about leasing to you if we don't know you and understand you. We might be perfectly comfortable on a more favorable lease when we know that you've got a plan for your equipment, you've got a plan for how you're financing inputs, that we're confident you're going to be around. And that's really having all of the pieces that you've most likely lined out, but being able to actually talk about those and how you're making it work. It's not a problem if you say, look, I'm maintaining an off-farm job until I'm able to farm full time. That might be totally reasonable. Or part of it might be I'm using older equipment and I'm keeping my equipment costs down. Again, totally reasonable, but giving us the talking points and think about that overview so we can say to a client, you told us you wanted a younger or emerging farmer or startup farmer. This is who we have in mind. This is how they're getting it done. It's not sufficient to say, oh, I don't have a huge capital base and I can't do cash rent. That doesn't give me anything to work with. Explaining how you're doing it, you're borrowing someone's equipment or you're sharing equipment with a family member, all those pieces can be okay and workable, including in some cases having somebody co-sign the lease, which makes us feel comfortable that you're going to be able to perform on it financially. Even in a crop share situation, that can be helpful as well. But having an answer is important, not just I can't do X. It's fine if you can't pay top dollar cash rent.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Jonah. I think that's all the questions we have today. So we're going to finish up a few minutes early here. So thank you to Jonah for being here with us today. And thank you to our sponsor for this session, Compeer Financial. And thank you to our AMP partners, Illinois Farm Business Farm Management, the University of Illinois Farm Doc, and the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. If you are a CCA, don't forget to claim your 1 CEU in professional development for this session. You can either scan the QR code on the screen or email our team with your CCA number by Friday to be submitted for credit. The recording of this presentation will be posted to the ISA webinar archives on YouTube and sent to all attendees via email this week. Please take a few minutes at the conclusion of this webinar to answer the survey. Your feedback helps us to continue to improve the program and our agribusiness resources. We hope to see you back here next week for our last AMP summer webinar on August 5th at 10 a.m. And you can find more information about those webinars at illinoissoyadvisor.com. Thank you for attending and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Emily.